Our first reading this morning is Psalm 81, verses 10 through 16. I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it. But my people did not listen to my voice. Israel would not submit to me. So I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own counsels. Oh, that my people would listen to me, that Israel would walk in my ways. Then I would quickly subdue their enemies and turn my hand against their foes. Those who hate the Lord would cringe before him, and their doom would last forever. I would feed you with the finest of the wheat, and with honey from the rock I would satisfy you.
I'm reading something slightly different than what it says in your bulletin. Rather than Luke 14, 1 through 14, we'll be reading Luke 14, 7 through 24. And as we listen to this, you'll notice that we kind of have two things happening in parallel. Jesus tells people to invite the poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind to their table. And then Jesus tells a parable immediately after that tells us to invite the poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind. And I think we can take two things from that. One, which is whenever we repeat something, it's got to be important. And two, that Jesus tells us in a parable format, talking about the kingdom of heaven, but also tells it in a practical format, talking about the kingdom of heaven that we are called to be on earth. So as we listen to these passages, let us hear both that this is what God's table is like for us, and also that this is what tables we are called to put into the world. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then, in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. One of the dinner guests, on hearing this, said to him, blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. Then Jesus said to him, someone gave a great dinner and invited many. At the time for the dinner, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is ready now. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a piece of land and I must go out and see it. Please accept my regrets. Another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I am going to try them out. Please accept my regrets. Another said, I have just been married, and therefore I cannot come. So the slave returned and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and said to his slave, go out at once into the streets and lanes of the town, and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. And the slave said, sir, what you have ordered has been done, and there is still room. Then the master said to the slave, go out into the roads and lanes and compel people to come in, so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those who were invited will taste my dinner. This is the word of the Lord. The table is one of the central images of Jesus' ministry and of Christian faithfulness. Jesus spent most of his ministry eating with people. The author, Robert Karras, who wrote a book called Eating Through the Gospel of Luke, says in Luke's Gospel, Jesus is either going to a meal at the meal or coming from a meal. In our story for today, he eats with the Pharisees. At other times, he eats with Zacchaeus. He eats with the two who walked to Emmaus. And of course, his most famous meal is the Last Supper, which he ate with the disciples. In today's passage, he's doing both. He's at a meal and he is talking about eating. And the next thing he does, of course, is tell a parable about a banquet. Again, food seems to be coming up a lot, and so it must be something that is important, something that we need to pay attention to. It's clear when Jesus came down to earth, he had eating on his mind. Now, table fellowship is at the heart of our ministry as well. It's at the heart of our worship, where the table holds a central place and where regularly we share bread and juice that has been blessed and broken for us from that table. But this isn't the only table where we do ministry. After worship, we're going to go downstairs and we're going to have coffee together and we're going to sit at tables and share about what's going on in our week and in our lives. We sit at tables when we come together to set up the summer lunch program, and we sit at tables when we have our community meal, third meal, where we welcome people from the community to sit down across from each other and share in the bounty of God. And of course, we sit at each other's tables all of the time as we share in supporting each other and caring for each other and watching over each other. Bobby showed me a book she found in the library called Most Ministers Wear Sneakers, which is talking about how most, I know, how most of the ministry that is done is not done by the pastor, but by the regular people who go out into the world caring about their neighbors. And I would add perhaps an addendum, which is that most ministry happens at tables. When you break bread with somebody, it's an ordinary thing, but it's also an intimate thing, right? It's a special thing to sit down and eat a meal with somebody. That's part of what it is to be people of faith, is to break bread with each other. And who you do it with matters. It matters at the lunchroom. It matters at the boardroom. It matters in every part of our lives, because who you eat with, who you share your table with, is who you'll build your life around, who you'll worry about, who you'll care for, whose worries will become your worries. So when Jesus talks about eating, I think we know what he means. And in today's passage, he gives us two things to think about. The first is for when we are at somebody else's table. And the second is for when we're setting our own tables. That first one, I think, is a piece of advice we can all hear and understand. It's one of those times when Jesus is highlighting some advice that shows up earlier in the Bible. In Proverbs 25:6, it says, "Don't exalt yourself in front of the king or try to step forward, for you're going to get embarrassed in front of everybody else." And Jesus is expanding that and explaining that. He says, don't exalt yourself over other people, because you're going to set yourself up to be put down. You think about how that goes, right? If you're the socially awkward kid, if you're the not cool kid, and you go into the lunchroom and you plop yourself down right in the middle of the cool kids' table, how is that going to go? Are you going to be welcomed with open arms, or are you going to become the butt of their jokes? If you've got one of those work cliques at your office where people always go to lunch together, and you just kind of invite yourself into that group, what's going to happen? Do you think that they're going to suddenly be excited to have you here, even though they had planned not to have you here? Or do you think they're going to resent you for interrupting their space that they want to have? And even if it feels like it's going well, how is it going to feel for you, knowing that you put yourself in that space rather than being invited in that space? Won't you always worry that they're laughing at you behind your back? Won't you always wonder if they really want you here, or if they're just kind of tolerating you to be polite? Won't you always wonder what you need to do to stay on their good side, to make sure that you'll continue to be allowed to be in the this place, it puts you in an uncomfortable, a tenuous, a difficult position where you're always worried. I think about the Sneetches in that Dr. Seuss story with the stars on their belly, and how all of them were so worried about being on the good side that they got stars on and stars off and stars on and stars off. And I don't know very much about tattoo removal, but I don't think it's a pleasant experience. Until they had all run completely out of money and the star putter on her, the tattoo artist, took off. None of them at any point felt secure about themselves, right? None of them at any point felt comfortable in who they were. They were always trying to get on there. And so what Jesus is telling us is when we exalt ourselves, we're setting ourselves up to be put down. And we're setting ourselves up for a lifetime of anxiety in which we feel scarce in a world of abundance. We feel like status is something that we have to claw for, that we have to fight for, and not something that we have been given simply because we live in a world with a loving God. You know, I once became a popular kid. It lasted about 9 months. I got seated in the back of a science class next to this other kid who thought I was funny. He said, hey, come on and be up at my table. And all of a sudden, things were great for me. Girls were talking to me, which was a new experience. I got to sit at the cool kids table. The people that used to pick on me left me alone. It was a great thing. It was an amazing thing. And then this fellow went to boarding school in the Northeast, and it all ended. And I was right back down where I had always been. And that's sort of how it goes sometimes. It feels good when somebody wants you to be there. But I knew that afterward, there was no putting myself back in that place because I wasn't wanted. And it would be more trouble. And I wonder at the friends I left behind and betrayed to go and hang out with the cool kids for a little while and live my nice dream of not being picked on and having girls talk to me and all those things, and what they felt like when I left. The second word that Jesus gives us isn't about when we're sitting at somebody else's table. It's about when we're setting our own tables. And it's the same basic principle as what he told us about when we're sitting at somebody else's tables. He said, don't exalt yourself. Don't use your table to lift yourself up. Use your table to lift somebody else up. It's about who you choose to set your table with. It can be easy to get in that mindset of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. All of us, I think, have a little bit of gun shyness about the economy, right? Like we all know and we all want to be employed during the next recession or just be employed right now. And that takes networking, right? You go places and you talk to people and you think, how can this person help me out? Let me see how that fellow at the White Shoe Law Firm is doing. Let me check in with my boss and see if they want to come over for burgers on Memorial Day. We want to protect and preserve ourselves, don't we? Is that not a thing that we do? And if we want to move up the corporate ladder, don't we have to make sure and know people? I think about that fellow sitting in an office waiting for an interview. And right before the interview, the person who just finished their interview comes out and the manager shakes their hand and says, hey, yeah, that was a lot of fun. It was good talking to you. See you at church. And then they go in for their interview and they don't get the job. Isn't that what we want for ourselves? But Jesus says something else. He says that if you try to use your table to exalt yourself, there's your reward right there. But there is a much deeper reward. When you open your table to the poor, when you open your table to the crippled, the lame, and the blind. I've talked about Sister Antonia before, who was a lovely divorcee in California. She had a nice life for herself. She had started her own business, but she felt a call from God. Now, nobody was interested in taking on middle-aged divorced nuns at that time, so she said, all right, I'll make my own order. And she sewed herself a habit. She made it for herself. She went down to her church and she made some vows. And then she went to Tijuana and she started going to the prison and bringing peanut butter sandwiches. And eventually she was at the prison so much that they gave her a cell, which she thought was very generous. And she spent the last 20 years of her life living in that prison. And she touched so many people's lives. She got people dental care that didn't have somebody to take care of their teeth, and we know how much that hurts. She stopped riots just by walking through them. And it was all because of where she put her table. She could have done the LA socialite thing. She could have done the gala circle, the sort of charitable giving circle, and she had done that for a number of years. But instead, she said, I'm going to put my table with the most vulnerable people. And she said, anybody can do this. It doesn't take much. It's not that hard to make a sandwich. It's just the choice to value what you will get by filling your table with somebody who's different from you, somebody who doesn't have what you think you need, but has what God knows that you need. Ultimately, Jesus is telling us that who you set your table for, who you sit down to eat with, is who you're going to shape your life with. It's what your life is going to look like. If you build your life around your own gain, exalting yourself over others, you're inviting yourself into a life that is spiritually empty. But if you humble yourself and use your power and influence to lift other people up, you will find yourselves spiritually rich. I think the most famous portrayal of a meal that Jesus had is that Da Vinci picture, The Last Supper. Can you guys think of that picture? Do you remember? If you don't, I set it to post on Facebook, so you have permission to look at your phones. And a few years ago, somebody pointed something out. It's kind of a silly thing, but did you notice that they're all sitting on the same side? Isn't that an awkward way to eat? You can see they're all leaning over each other because they can't talk to each other. Well, we can say that's just how Leonardo did it, to get everybody in the shot, right? So you can see all the disciples and not the backs of their heads. Or we can imagine that there's somebody else at the table. Was it maybe Mary and Salome, Joanna? Those people who brought spices down to the tomb, who we know had been with him. Was it Matthias who had been with him the whole time but isn't even mentioned until Acts? Did Jesus do what he talked about in this parable? Was the Last Supper Jesus' final intimate supper with his disciples and the poor, the lame, the crippled, and the blind? Who is at our table? When you set your table, who is invited? Who is missing? Who isn't there? And how might we shape our table? Not so that we could become materially rich, but so that we could become spiritually rich. So that we could become filled with the presence of God, so that we could receive the incredible abundance of God's glorious children all coming together to share one meal. This image of a table is one of the images that Christians have used to talk about what heaven is like. We're going to sing, I'm going to eat at the welcome table, that table where all of us are welcome. And more than anything else, I think that is one of the most crucial images of the table for us, which is wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever you've done, wherever you've been, there is a place at God's table for you. but also that God's table is not like the tables that we regularly set for ourselves. God's table is a table where everyone can have enough. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is a Christian martyr from the Holocaust and a theologian, wrote in his book Life Together, which is a beautiful book about just the basics of what it is to be Christians with one another. He said, the table fellowship of Christians implies obligation. It is our daily bread, not my own. We share our bread. No one dares go hungry as long as another has bread. And he who breaks the fellowship of the physical life also breaks the fellowship of the spirit. I think that's a long quote. I think what he's saying is that if we're all eating at the same table, nobody can go hungry because all we have to do is pass it down. If we think about the image that we've been given for our Christian life, our worship life, for our home life, it's this image of a table where everybody is welcome. And if everybody comes to the table, if we're all eating at the same table, nobody can go hungry, nobody can go without, nobody cannot have enough. Because all of us will be in that wonderful, holy place, God's community, in which we do not lift ourselves up, but we lift each other up. And then, and only then, can we say what David says at the end of Psalm 23, that our cups overflow. In the name of the Father, and the Son,